Hey everyone, so welcome to another lecture in Intro to Political Science. So today we're going to be looking at political influence. So part of political influence, we'll be looking at interest groups, a little bit on social movements, and then we'll conclude with kind of a bit of the intro to our section on the media. So the next two classes after will be focused on the media, one on kind of the regular media, and then on soft news and social media. So kind of some of the newer entrants into the, I guess, politics of news or politics of the media. So today's lecture, the reading for today was chapter 8 in the textbook. So we're going to start with political influence and interest groups. So what's interesting with interest groups is kind of the connotation that will come to mind for most people. Most people will have a fairly unbiased, or I'm sorry, a fairly biased view right from hearing the name interest group. For some, they may immediately come to kind of the idea of business lobbyists who are trying to sway policy for a limited number, usually of, say, wealthier interests, may come to mind. So there may kind of seem to be a lot of money involved in it and non-democraticness. So that when that comes to mind, often we'll think kind of negatively about interest groups. And other times, social movements or interest groups related to kind of social issues. So a group like Amnesty International or an environmental lobby group may come to mind, and you might think more positively, be like, hey, these interest groups really help us to solve important issues. So depending on kind of how you think about interest groups, you may already have kind of a positive or negative view of them. So I guess I encourage you, whatever kind of perspective you're coming from today, to try to think about, if you have a positive connotation or positive thoughts about it, think about what are, even with the group you like, what are the negative sides here? And if you've got a negative view on it, think about what are the positive effects that interest groups can have within a democracy, because there's such a variety of different interest groups. Even the ones that you might think of or agree with what they're doing, they've got positive and negative effects. And the groups that you don't necessarily agree with what they're doing, there's positive and negative effects. So interest groups are groups that pursue the common interests of groups of people by trying to influence the development, adoption, and implementation of public policy. So they're groups that are trying to affect policy in certain areas. They're representing particular groups, so the common interest of particular groups. Those groups could be very limited. It could be an interest group that's representing a small segment of the population, and with a very focused issue, or it could be a wider interest group that's trying to influence a broad range of policies for what could be a large number, a portion of the population. But the idea here is that they've got particular interests in mind, so they're advocating on behalf of particular interests, and they're trying to affect policy. So shape public policy, shape government decisions and implementation of government decisions, so that particular policies are put in place. There's been a significant growth in the number of interest groups over the past decades, the size of their membership and the diversity of their interests that they represent. A lot of this makes sense, given that governments over the decades have had to deal with more and more and more issues. Governments handle so much more than they did in the past. So as governments make decisions about so many more issues, then you're going to have more people affected by these decisions. And anytime you have people who are affected by government decisions, they're more likely to want to influence those decisions. Many interest groups don't only exist for political purposes, so some are created explicitly for political purposes, or created to by a particular interest, so say an economic group to lobby a government. Others exist for other purposes, but as part of kind of achieving their goal, they require some form of government intervention government support friendly policy. So it could be an interest that was created for any number of non-political reasons, but they create a political arm because of a need to engage with government policy. We could think about one way that we could divide interest groups are in terms of self-interest or public interest groups, or ones that kind of identify in that way. Self-interest groups are those whose primary objective is to promote the interest of the group and its members. The membership could be tiny or small. It could be a wide range. It could be many, many people who make up its membership, or it could be a small number of people. So it could be a business lobby that represents kind of the business owners. So a relatively small number of business owners within a particular segment of the economy. So it could be, for example, an aviation interest group that is advocating on behalf of the owners of the aviation companies within the country. Relatively small number of aviation companies with a relatively small number of owners or elite, so representing their a relatively focused group. It could also be, for example, if we take scale saying on the business side, or if you think about labor groups, some of the labor groups would be representing hundreds of thousands of members, or in particular industries. So if you take, for example, ones in some of the manufacturing type segments, or in farming, would be representing thousands of members. In either case, the goal of the interest group is to represent the interest of those members. Public interest groups are seeking to achieve goals that they view as being in the general interest of the community as a whole. So whether you're a member of the interest group or not, this public interest group is going to be acting in a way that it views as being in your best interest. So if you think about like a group like Amnesty International, for example, would be such a group where whether you're a member of Amnesty International or not, they're working to try to help put in place policies that will help all humankind. You could put environmental groups, whether you're a member of the environmental group or not. They're trying to combat environmental degradation that's going to affect all of us. So they would view themselves as a public interest group. The distinction between self and public interest groups can often not be clear, right? And oftentimes clever self-interest groups will try to portray themselves as if they're a public interest group. So, for example, food manufacturing company, so a self-interested group in terms of food manufacturing, or pharmaceutical companies, for example, self-interested pharmaceutical groups may produce commercials or lobbying efforts that appear to be talking about policies that need to be put in place for the health of everyone in society. And so they're saying that these policies will help everyone. It's in the public interest for us to put in place these food standards, for us to put in place these health standards, to put in place these drug requirements, or to authorize these type of health programs, whatever it might be. They'll frame it as if it's in the public interest, but really it's paid for by the self-interest groups, and the policies that they're saying are in the public interest would be helping them to make a profit. Whether or not there may be public benefits, right? So sometimes it's true, the public may benefit. Other times the information that's being provided is misleading. There may not be a clear public benefit, but there's clearly a self-interested benefit. So sometimes it can be difficult to see the differences if you're just looking at the commercial and you're not aware who's this commercial coming from. You might think, hey, this is in the public interest, so this must be coming from a public interest group, where it's really coming from a very small lobby. So the distinction can be difficult sometimes. You also could have differences in the interest groups in terms of how well established they are. So you could have issue-oriented or institutionalized interest groups. So issue-oriented interest groups are a group that spontaneously is created to express the views of the people on a particular issue, concern, or grievance. So an issue arises on the public policy landscape, or a public issue arises in general, something that's affecting a segment of the population. The issue-oriented group, there's a segment of the population that cares deeply about this issue, and so they organize to deal with this issue. So the group didn't exist before because the issue didn't exist before, and they organized to take care of the issue. So it often only has a temporary existence and no concern for formal organization. The goal is to deal with this particular issue that's arisen in this particular moment in time. It wasn't needed before. Once this issue is dealt with, there's no anticipation that it will be needed for a longer time. So there's no need to put in place formal long-term structures beyond what's needed to deal with the issue at that time and at that place. Institutionalized interest groups, on the other hand, involve a formal organization that includes such features as a well-established membership base, paid professional staff, permanent offices, and the capacity to keep its members and the public aware of its views and activities. So these would be longer-term interest groups. They could be public interested or self-interested, depending. So either could be institutionalized. So again, if you think of an environmental group or Amnesty International, which would be institutionalized interest groups, but so too would most labor groups and most business groups, right? They have continual need to be dealing with politicians, to be affecting public policy. It's not usually just a one-off that, for example, a labor group may have to be dealing with the government. There's continual changes to policy that they may be seeking, or there's continued changes to policies they may be trying to avoid. They have continued political interests, and so they will create a formal organization so that they can be maximally effective, right? So a membership based on kind of long-standing members. So it may be members of a union, for example, may form part of an interest group, or different businesses will come together to form the interest group. Paid professional staff, because there's long-standing need to be working with the government, it makes sense to have people who know how to do it and who could be keeping track of the political side of the issue. So political experts with political contacts who know how to handle these issues at the political level. Part of that then would require offices and informational needs, right? So both to be able to keep the public aware of the issue, so if you want to be getting the public on your side, but also to keep the membership up to date on what's going on. So for example, if you're a public sector union that's negotiating with the government over a new contract, the membership is going to want to be knowing how is this negotiation going with the government. So you need the capacity to be able to communicate effectively with the government, with your members. But also if the negotiations aren't going well and you think that the public may be supporting you, so if you're a healthcare union or an education union, you may be wanting to be able to communicate effectively with the public to say these are the unreasonable demands that the government is making, or these are the concessions the government's not willing to be making, hoping that the public will be on your side when it comes to these issues, and so that you could try to get public support, wider public support on your side and put pressure on the government. Institutionalized groups tend to be recognized by government as being legitimate representatives that expect to be consulted when policies affect their interests, right? So on many of these different issues, so for example, if you're putting in place a policy in a particular economic sector, right? There'd be kind of an expectation government would expect to be consulting with, say, the labor and the business groups associated with that sector, right? See what are the owners, what are the of the companies, what's the business side saying on it, but also what are the employees saying on that particular issue. So what are the different stakeholder groups involved in a particular area? what are their thoughts on this issue? So at minimum, you would usually expect on any given issue to be consulting with these groups during the process of creating the policies. There's multiple reasons that you may want to be doing this. First, these groups often can have a lot of information that could be useful for the policymaking process. Another is that these groups have intense preferences on these issues, more so than generally the public would. So if you want to be maintaining their support, and in democracies, typically governments want to be maintaining the most support from as many different groups as possible, before putting in place new policies, you'd want to be checking with the stakeholders and seeing how do these different stakeholders view this policy, view this issue, to see if you can get as many of them supporting as possible. Membership and interest groups. So organized collective action gives individuals a chance to be influential, which is usually why people join and support interest groups, right? So in a democracy, as an individual, if I've got an individual argument against government, if I just call up my MP and yell at them about this issue or discuss it with this issue, as articulate as I may be on the issue and as good as my facts may be on this issue, it's very unlikely it's going to shape policy, because all I'm really bringing to bear is my opinion. So there's little credibility that this is going to shape or bring large numbers of voters to the government side. There's no evidence that necessarily anybody else really agrees with me. If you want to be in a democracy, if you want to be affecting change, you need to be showing governments care about staying in power. So you need to be able to be showing that you're bringing interested voters with you. And so collective action is ultimately much more powerful than individual action. Even if it's a large number of individuals. When it's collectively organized, it shows that this is a group that cares intensely about this issue. This may be a voting issue for them. If you don't put in place policies that they care about here, they may not vote for you. So it's important enough that it could affect voting. And so this could be a more effective way of getting change. Most individuals are much more likely to be able to influence political decisions through involvement in an organization than by trying to work by themselves. So reasons for joining interest groups could be selective incentive. So it could be that incentives that you'd be getting based on this interest group. So if you're a worker in a particular industry, joining the union, you want to be getting the benefits of that comes with being in the union and having the union negotiate for you. Personal satisfaction from expressing one's values and contributing to the good of the community, right? So some people get excited about the possibility of participating and expressing their views and fighting for the good of their community, whether it's the wider public, the wider community, or the community that's covered by the interest group. So if you look at any given group, you're gonna have a large number of members, for example, say, of a union, but only some really come forward and work to take on leadership roles. And so one would expect that those who come forward get some form of personal satisfaction from doing so. And then social engagement with like-minded people. People typically like being part of communities with other people who share similar interests or who think similarly to them. Joining an interest group, if you select an interest group that is of interest to you, you're joining with other people who share those interests. So think again of a public interest one, so say an environmental group. You're finding by joining the interest group, you're finding other people who share that interest with you, who are passionate about environmental politics, who want to be making a change in the community. So you're finding a group who thinks like you. So how does the government support interest groups? Are they opposed to the government? They're often lobbied the government. So Or like we said before, are they part of the legitimate part of the political process? So the Canadian government, for example, has at times encouraged and financed the development of groups representing segments of the population that are largely underrepresented by organized interest groups. So the Canadian government may even help with the formation of these groups that are lobbying on issues that the government feels are important, or are lobbying on behalf or representing groups that aren't traditionally well represented by other groups. So this may be Indigenous peoples, women, people living in poverty. So people living in poverty, for example, often don't have, or having a an institutionalized interest group requires resources, right? And people living in poverty often don't have excess resources to be able to put in towards creating institutionalized interest groups. They certainly don't have the same resources compared to, say, those they may be competing against in the political process. So say it's an issue between poor poor individuals living in a city and urban developers, right? The urban developers are going to be able to bring forward much more resources to be able to organize interest groups. So the government will at times help encourage the formation and help fund the formation of interest groups so that those who are traditionally marginalized have a voice at the table, particularly when we're talking about how the government usually views it as legitimate to consult with the different interests involved in an issue. You want to make sure that there are groups representing all of the important stakeholders, not only the stakeholders who are wealthy enough or who have enough political power or clout to be able to organize an interest group. Some governments have reduced or eliminated funding of interest groups that are critical of government policies. So this is always a debated issue, and this is always a contentious issue, is that in terms of the funding that goes to interest groups, how should that be allocated? Does the government get to choose which groups get it? Because that's potentially problematic if you eliminate funding, for example, groups who take certain social stances, whether they be liberal or conservative stances. You know, some people will tout that as being good choices, reflecting the values of the country, and why should the government be supporting those who don't support the same values as other Canadians? Others will view that as kind of biasing policy in a particular direction. If government already holds a particular value or a particular stance on the issue, and the only interest groups who are given a seat at the table or given the funding to be able to be at the table are those who think like the government, then you're not having a real honest debate on the issue. You're not giving all the different stakeholders the ability to participate. Government funding of interest groups has been criticized by those who feel that some groups are too radical or represent special interests. So there's certainly funding or even just dealing with certain groups will always be contentious if it's viewed that these groups are representing too small of a population or a population whose views are viewed as too extreme for many members of the public. And this could be too extreme on the left or right, or something that doesn't follow along left-right. It could be special interest on a small economic or social issue. It can sometimes be foreign interests. Some groups will certainly are more accepted more widely than others. And business interests are subsidized by government through tax deductions. So there are certain tax deductions involved interest groups. So even business groups have some financial incentive or some financial help for organizing interest groups. So what are interest group activities that they may participate in to influence the government? So they can have inside strategies and outside strategies. Inside strategies are those where the members of the interest group, or at least the leaders of the interest group, the professional staff of the interest groups, develop close contacts with decision makers in government and the public service in order to influence public policies, right? So they may become people who are friends with members of the government, who are friends with members of the uh, uh, different government departments involved in making policies with the senior members in the relevant bureaucracies. And so through these friendships, right, through these dinners and lunches and parties, they're able to sit down and have discussions with their friends. So these can be sometimes worrying in that you don't want friendship swaying public policy. You don't want, a conversation that's had over drinks necessarily to be influencing public policy. But it's also a large way of how the game is played. One concern that sometimes people who watch government have, and some countries have certainly legislated on this to try to restrict it, is that you have kind of a revolving door of interest group, kind of the professional staff interest group and members of government, or either elected or non-elected members of government, kind of a revolving door where someone works, becomes a senior member in a particular bureaucracy, leaves that bureaucracy, goes to work for an interest group that's working on that type of issue. So they already know the process, they already know the people. And so they can use that expertise to help the interest group. And then sometimes we'll go back into government after a while and then come back out and kind of do this revolving circle. Or it could be, an elected member who loses an election, so they go to work for an interest group. And then if they win re-election, they're in politics again. But there's always the concern of an unfair playing field. So someone who leaves the bureaucracy or leaves government and goes into the interest group has kind of an unfair knowledge of others who are still working there, but also in terms of the processes and the levers of power. But also once they go back into government, are they representing the public, or are they representing the interest group who they may hope to be returning to afterwards? And even if, and then for those who are still in government, will they be putting in place policies hopeful of getting a job afterwards? So if you're close to leaving a bureaucracy, if you're thinking of retiring from the bureaucracy and going on to the private sector, will you start putting in place policies or being more favorable to lobby groups who you're hoping to, or interest groups who you're hoping to get hired from? And then there's outside strategies. So interest group leaders appeal to the public for support and mobilize members to put pressure on decision makers concerning public policies. So this could be either, so this is more outward and getting others to put pressure on political elites. So it could be by having the public, the wider public, so even those who aren't side of the interest groups, or again, when I talked about, say, healthcare or teacher unions, may appeal to the wider public, saying, look at how the government's operating in negotiations with us. But it may also just be trying to get members to put pressure on the government through pressure tactics, through protest campaigns or letter writing campaigns to show how much the membership cares about this issue, to strikes, or work to rural type orders, anything like that. Interest groups tend to use a mixture of inside and outside strategies, so internal, external pressure all at the same time. And activities include lobbying, direct involvement in public policy, such as things like think tanks. So they could sponsor think tanks who produce reports on issues, and these reports are then maybe sent to government to help them make their decision. Mobilizing the public to a cause, and use of the judicial system. So suing if there's a policy that they don't like. Lobbying is one of the activities that gets a lot of attention. So lobbying is an effort to pursue those involved with making and implementing public policies, to adopt policies through direct physical contact. So it's meeting with those in government and trying to, through conversations, get them to change policies. Legislation that regulates the activities of lobbyists and requires them to be publicly disclosed has been implemented. So this goes part of what I was talking about with the revolving door, is that we want to know who are lobbyists and who they're lobbying for. A, to keep track of what kind of who's coming in and out of lobbying, but also to see what who's trying to pressure, who's just having a conversation, and who's trying to be working on behalf of a particular interest. Interest groups often supply information that government policymakers need and work with policymakers to find effective solutions to problems. So for better and for worse, different interest groups often have information that is very relevant on a policy issue that the government may or may not have. Because if you're lobbying on a particular issue, this issue is important to members of the interest group. They often have, and often members of the interest group are working in those areas, are putting in a lot of effort in gathering information in those areas, are experts on those areas. They may have greater expertise sometimes than many members of the government or the policymaking community will on those issues. So they could be supplying information. This is useful in that it helps the government have a better picture of the issue. It can be detrimental if you're not getting information from all different sides, right? So if you don't have proper representation or access from everyone on each side, the information will be probably often provided will be accurate, but it may be skewed or biased, right? So it's not going to be the entire picture. If you're trying to lobby, if you're a business group and you're trying to lobby for a particular say tax break, right? You're going to provide all the information that is supportive of the claim for that a tax break is important. You're not likely to, and all that information may be accurate, but there's probably information on the other side that is less supportive of your claim that's also accurate that you're going to leave out. That's where it's because government, when they're doing their search for information, we trust should be looking for all different perspectives. We know that interest groups have a particular end in goal. And so they're providing information that is helpful in that for that goal. Most interest groups attempt to gain support from the public. We've talked about that. And legal action can be used for and against interest groups. Influence potential. Several factors contribute to the amount of influence an interest group can exert, including the size of the group's membership. So all else being equal, the larger the membership, the more influence they can bring to bear. Again, remember, ultimate goal in a democracy is to stay in power. For both politicians. The more potential voters you can say that you're bringing with you on a particular issue that you're representing, the larger share of the voting public you're representing, the more you can affect re-election. So all else being equal, the larger the group, the larger the membership, the more influence it can have. The ability to mobilize members and supporters. So the more you can get, not just say we represent these people, but have those members speak up and make noise and say how important this issue is to them. Remind them of what benefit can come to working with this group, and punishment can come from not working with them, can be effective. Financial resources, so all else being equal, more financial resources you have, the better off you are. So you could hire with more resources. You can better communicate with your members and with the public. You can better organize your contacts with the government. You can have more reports and more information to bring to bear. You can have better legal strategies if it needs to go to court. So most of the different activities that interest groups pursue do require money. And the more money you have, the more of these different activities you could be doing all at once. Ties with government, with key government policymakers. So the closer you are with those who are actually making the decisions, while you could have all kinds of great information that you're bringing to bear and giving to people who aren't actually making decisions, the more you can get the ear and have a one-on-one conversation or a small group discussion with the people who are actually making the decision, the more access you have there, the more likely you are to sway them. Expertise and credibility, all else being equal, the more that you are viewed as a credible voice who understands the issue area and who is providing useful information that's going to help in making better policy, the more influence you're going to have. If there's any questions about how much you actually understand this issue, then why would the government want to be following your information and following your cue and making policy? Whether ideas coincide with those of government, this should make sense. All else being equal, the government could be more receptive to ideas that already fit with what they're thinking and with their preferences. They'll be more resistant to those that challenge their priorities or their views on a particular issue. Doesn't mean that those who take an opposing view to the government can't win if they meet enough of these other criteria, but they're fighting an uphill battle right from the start. The ability to make credible threats. So the ability to say that, we are going to organize something that's costly to you, whether it's our voters will, or our members will vote against you next time, or we're going to bring a costly strike, or we're going to bring a strong public information campaign that's going to, that could be costly for you, or we're going to sue you and we have a strong case for winning and we can bring the best lawyers to bear. The more of these threats you can be making, the more influence you have. And then the degree of competition among groups. The more competition there is, the less influence any group will have, because the more it's a contested environment with people speaking on each side, the government's looking at it and saying, it's less, the more different viewpoints there are, the harder it is for any one viewpoint to win, but also the harder it is for them to convince the government that, hey, we're bringing, you need us to stay in power. Because if it's a contested issue where there's people on large groups on all different sides, then whichever viewpoint you choose, you're also alienating a lot of other people. So the more that the competition there is among groups, the more different voices they're coming to bear, the harder it is for yours to stand out. We've seen a lot in recent years talks about social movements. So to start, what are social movements? A social movement would be a network of groups and individuals that seeks major social and political changes, particularly by acting outside of established political institutions. So often they're taking place, so interest groups often at the start are taking place within the political process. Social movements often kind of start outside of the established political institutions. And it could be a network of individuals, it could be a network of groups, right? So there could be a number of groups who care about a particular issue and they come together to form this social movement. So it could be, for example, if you looked at an environmental social movement, it could be a number of individuals who are coming together to make the movement. It could be individuals who aren't part of any groups joining together with a series of groups who are already working on it to create a larger movement. And social movements are seeking major social and or political change. They have a lengthy history, so it's nothing new when we're talking about social movements. Some of the more recent ones that have that we hear about prominently. So in the 1960s, there was the civil rights movement in the U.S. And then also in other countries. we've also seen similar time period and since growth in the women's movement, environmental movement, indigenous movement, and LGBTQ movements. We've also seen kind of more on social justice movements related to the economy in terms of anti-globalization and Occupy movements. Some of these issues from the 1960s, they never went away. So civil rights, women's movement, environmental movements, so on and so forth, they never went away. So say, it was the 1960s and then reoccurred today is unfair to those groups that were working on it in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. There certainly were many people who were working on, for example, racial issues or gender issues across the decades. But the 1960s was a particular time of heightened, say, social awareness on it. And you can make an argument for the 2010s being another one where there were certainly multiple, you had the Me Too movements that gained sizable attention. You had the Black Lives Matter movement that got substantial attention from the wider public, from those outside of the groups who are traditionally working on it. So in the 2010s, there was kind of an increased prominence for social movements. Not all social movements are progressive challenges to existing political and social order. So most of the ones that we named here would be progressive movements, often more associated with the left and the right, not uniquely. There will be many supporters on the conservatives who will support many of these different groups and many of these different social movements. So not to say it's exclusively an area of the left, but they're most of these we would associate with being progressive. There's social movements that aren't necessarily progressive. So for example, if we think of the Tea Party movement in the United States, that was more of a conservative social movement, more traditional values movement as opposed to a progressive. So it's more of a conservative social stability as opposed to progressive change. It was reactionary as opposed to, say, progressive. Now, social movements do change over time. So the demobilization, routinization, or institutionalization of a movement describes the tendency of organizations based on social movements to become more conventional over time. So oftentimes, again, they start outside of political process. It's kind of a loose grouping. It could be of different individuals in different groups without a formal organizational structure. Over time, eventually, oftentimes, a formal structure does begin to emerge. This could be a contested process. It could be a slow process. To a large extent, it makes sense once a social movement has emerged. When a social movement emerges, it can get a lot of publicity. It can create a lot of pressure, but it can't really often focus that pressure and do many of the things that are needed to actually affect the change. Because they exist outside of the traditional institutionalized politics, and most decisions get made within the traditional avenues of politics. So it makes sense in terms of being able to translate the social movement's desires into policy to have kind of eventually the development of a more formalized, institutionalized structure, but also just in terms of organizing. If you've got a loose grouping of many different people from many different groups participating in an issue, if you want to be having common action, sustained common action, it requires some form of organization to mobilize the groups at particular times and particular events to figure out the strategies that what are the ultimate demands. Everybody cares about these issues who participate in the social movement, but how do we translate that into, say, concrete policy demands? Well, you need people who are going to sit down and develop those concrete demands. So it makes sense that we see this gradual routinization, institutionalization. It could be a hotly contested process, right? So You'll often have in different social movements, different claimants to power, or to different claimants to being the leaders of the group. And other claimants to be leaders may disagree amongst themselves. So the different leaders may disagree with the other ones. You also may have those who view like the social movement as a social movement, as something that doesn't have a leadership. They may oppose any attempts to brutalize it, to institutionalize it, to make it more regular politics. So you'll have some elements that will resist any form of organization, and then you'll have some who will oppose certain forms of organization based on certain viewpoints. The adoption of conventional interest group strategies is frequently seen as selling out. So that's what I was talking about. Some will view it as by going kind of into the formal institutionalized process, you're becoming one of them. You're selling out the goal, the movement, and sometimes results in creating new groups focused on grassroots organization and confrontation. So you're going to have those who are members of social movements, some who ultimately value the grassroots and the confrontational aspect of it and view that as being the end of itself, or view confrontation as the route to affecting change. And then you're going to have some members of the social movement who use the social movement as a way to, or view the social movement's goal as a way to get the issue on the government's radar, so that you get access into the political process so that you can affect change. So they would view it as confrontation isn't the way that you're actually going to get policy changes made. And so the way you get policy changes made is you need to get a seat at the table, and you need to be able to work with government. You need to be able to compromise with the government. And those two kind of viewpoints aren't often going to see eye to eye. Social movements aren't exclusively found within a particular group. You can also have transnational social movements. So many social movements have global reach and influence the politics of many countries. So there's issues, think about the environment, right? Environmental politics affects people across many, many different countries. So you're gonna have many, if you have an environmental social movement, or social movement based on gender. You have gender discrimination as a common feature across all countries, to be honest. So there's like-minded individuals and groups who are working within particular countries, but they also have others who are working for similar goals within other countries. And so they'll often collaborate, share information, share resources, share tactics, support each other, sometimes even put pressure on. So for example, a Canadian social move, or Canadian groups may put, our advocates may put pressure on the Canadian government, saying, asking the Canadian government to get involved and put pressure on the other government to try to help get change. Advances in communication and transportation have aided the global reach of social movements. So think about how easy it is to organize with groups in other countries now to be dealing with common interests. Now that communication is instantaneous, you can video chat, you can Zoom or Skype or WebEx with people anywhere in the world now, which makes organizing for common cause so much easier than it was in the past. And finally, we're going to touch briefly on media, and kind of as the introduction to what we'll be covering in future classes. So some of the questions that emerge when it comes to media and politics involves ownership and regulation. So communication media is a major source of political influence with the ability to raise issues and shape public debate, right? So most people get their political information from news sources, right? So our political knowledge, our understanding of political issues, which issues we're aware of and we think are important, and how we view them, how they're portrayed, all come from the media. And so the media does play a very important role in politics, which means that understanding the media, right, with great power comes, not to go with with power, great power comes great responsibility, but comes with great power comes the ability to do a public service, but also to do a great public disservice. And so understanding how the media operates is very important to actually understanding politics in democracies. In many countries, there's a mixture of private and public ownership of the broadcast media. So think again about Canada. CBC is publicly owned. The other news media, so CTV and related networks, global and related networks, are privately owned. Often in Canada by telecommunication companies. So CTV being Bell owned, for example. So that's common in many different countries. Public owned, it started in terms of being able to, when it was costly to create networks, governments were some of the earlier ones who were able to do so, but also kind of with the view of there's certain content that's good for the country that private networks may not provide that the public network could. So you could control more of the content and provide, say, more cultural content that's viewed as important, more educational content, more news content. But the majority of media still in most democracies is privately owned and owned by large corporations. And so there's increasing worry with media being owned by large corporations that there'll be bias in how they portray politics, how they portray the news, and they'll be kind of part of, interest groups. Remember, interest groups will play to the public, right? We'll try to mobilize support by the public. If you own a media company, right, you've got an amazing opportunity to present your case to the public, right? To promote your interests and frame your interests as being the public interest in how you present politics to and the information you give to the public. So there is some worry about ownership when it comes to serving the public interest. The broadcast media is regulated in most countries to try to ensure that they act in the public interest. So because there is the fear about who owns it and what is being given to the public, and the recognition of how important the media is to a democracy, there are regulations put in place about what you can and can't say, and in terms of, and measures put in place to make sure that media serves the public interest. So for example, broadcast media is required to provide nonpartisan coverage of politics during election campaigns in most countries. So they're supposed to give, for example, say in many countries, equal time to the different political parties. So you can't just choose one political party and give it much more time than to the others. In some countries, this is done much better than others. If you look, for example, at the US, last US election, well, there's some effort to try to bring in both sides. And if you look at panels that often are held on the news networks discussing politics, there'll be representatives or people who are aligned with both parties. And on CNN, you'll often have your token Republican, and on Fox News, you'll have your token Democrat. But increasingly in the US context, it's hard to say that many of the media outlets are providing nonpartisan coverage, but there are still some rules that even they will follow in terms of giving access to both sides, to speeches from both sides, if politicians want to come on from both sides, in terms of debates, supporting giving equal time to both sides. So even the most biased networks there's certain elements of nonpartisan campaign coverage that they will respect. Some by regulation and some hopefully just even by a sense of public interest or recognition that they're members of, of the country too, and they have some responsibility. So along with kind of this ownership, a lot of what we've been talking about then is the question of, is the media objective or is the media biased in its coverage? And objectivity and fairness is very difficult to achieve. Now you can obviously be biased intentionally, right? So you can, be consciously aware that you're going to choose particular stories because it serves your company's interest, right? We're not talking about that necessarily, although that is a problem. But there's even kind of like other ways that objectivity becomes very difficult. So, for example, even if you're choosing a story you've got, say, 60 minutes of a news program, and you've got to figure out which stories to put in. You can't choose all the stories that happened in that given day. So at minimum, you're using a power of choosing which stories, right? And some things get left in, and some things get left out, right? So there's a bias in terms of you're presenting some stories and you're not presenting some stories. Then every story needs an angle, right? And there's many different angles you could choose. You can only choose one or two angles, right? So some angles come in, some angles come out. So in each of these different cases, there's places where bias can come in terms of what type of stories are you choosing, what type of angles are you choosing. And you could try to be as objective as possible, but you're never going to be presenting all the sides. You're never going to be neutral, completely neutral in a story. Reporters do attempt to be as impartial, fair, and balanced, but they still ultimately frame the story in a particular way. They still give portray the story from a particular angle. And we'll talk more about framing next time. The media can help check the power of government and pressure governments to correct problems, but journalists rely often on government officials for information. So as much as the government may trying to be objective on a story or even be trying to pursue a public interest on a story, the source of information is often coming from one particular side, the government. Or if it's a story on business, a public interest story on business, they're probably getting a lot of the information about that business from the business. So because more information often comes from one's perspective in a story than from the other perspective, that gives, for example, in this case, the government power over the media. So if, for example, say there's a new international conflict that's emerging and the government's trying to present the conflict, whether it's good or bad, objectively. Well, because it's foreign policy and information is much more difficult to get in foreign policy, the biggest source of information that the government, that the media will have early in the crisis, in the war, will be the government. So it's difficult then to give a balanced story on the action when all the information you're getting is from the government, who have an incentive to portray or to present information that supports the policies that they've chosen. Governments and politicians often try to control and shape the news in order to affect public's evaluation of news stories. So they'll try to control which stories come out, so what makes it into the news landscape, and how it's framed, how it's presented. And techniques of news management include issuing news releases close to news deadlines. So, for example, say you've got to release information. You may time it to be just too late for it to get onto a news broadcast. Or if you put out the news release at particular times of day, it's just going to miss a particular news cycle, and it may be already old news by the time the next news cycle comes up. This was particularly problematic at the times where you say you had newspapers that came out once or twice a day. You had your say morning, your lunch, and your evening, and then your maybe 10 p.m. news slot. But you had a few different news segments per day. And so if you just missed one of those windows, it was a while until the next one. So you could kind of bury a story and hope that it didn't get picked up. Even though you had to release information about it, and you did, you put it out at a tactical time to try to get as little news coverage of it as possible. Using spin doctors, so kind of partisan people who are going on the news to try to take the information that's coming out and portray it in a particular way, spin it to make it look as positive as possible. So again, think about watching a network like CNN or Fox, and you've got your Democrat representative and your Republican one, and they take whatever information comes in, and it could be the same bit of information comes in, and one tries to portray that same information in a way that makes the Democrats look good, and the other takes the same bit of information and tries to present it in a way that makes Republicans look good, and you're left scratching your head saying, this is one bit of information, yet both of them are saying it as if it's a victory for their side. And unless both won, which neither is claiming, it's hard to believe. And then direct advertising. So bypass the ability of, say, the news media to be able to frame it in the way they want and go right to, say, commercials and present the information directly to the public. Media plays, like we've been talking about, a crucial role in democracy. Now, there is debate then about whether the media does a good job. So does it portray the political information that's needed for the public to make informed decisions and make decisions, about their political life, make intelligent choices among parties and candidates, for example, an election, or to hold those in public office accountable for their action? Does the media give us the relevant information that we need to participate in democracy? And what's often difficult here is that media organizations have twin goals. Yes, they have the democratic duty to, or responsibility, and this is often even legislated or regulated, that they have a responsibility to the public to keep them informed. And I think particularly many in kind of the political sides, to say the news side of media, I take that seriously and are well-intentioned, I think, from that perspective. But there's also the understanding that media companies, the private ones, are businesses, right? And businesses are there to make profit. And so they need to make profit, they need audiences. And so they're, they have to respond to this inherent tension between the fact that what's in the public interest isn't necessarily what interests the public. So the things that we need to hear to be intelligent members of a democracy isn't necessarily the thing that most people want to hear. And so maintaining, kind of doing your public service and maintaining large audience and being profitable can be competing interests. So because mass media require large audiences in order to be profitable, entertaining audiences becomes a primary focus even for news and public affairs programming. So even in terms of news programs, which aren't necessarily what we think of as entertainment, even they will portray news in the way that will keep the audience engaged and attract the largest audience possible. This is sometimes labeled as infotainment, so entertainment mixed in with information. So in order to do so, news can often be increasingly simplistic, and they'll focus on short reports. So the quicker that you change to different subjects, the more you keep the viewer engaged. And with a preference for stories about conflict and controversy that appeal to broad audiences. So certain stories are more appealing to a larger audience than others. The more sensational ones, the ones that involve the most controversy, those are the ones that sell, so to speak. And so you're going to have a disproportionate number of those covered compared to ones that maybe of important public interest, but that are less sensational and have less say, inherent conflict in it or controversy in it that may then be undercovered. This has led to some problems, for example, when it comes to issues of fear about crime. So for example, many news stories will spend a good portion of the time covering crime. And partially that's because, yes, those are news stories, but they're also news stories that often sell, that get viewers. And so because of that, many people, since the media has become more audience concerned, people's perceptions of the rate of crime in their area has increased. And part of the reason being that when they go to the media, half the show, half the media program, half the news program is about crime. And so when they're thinking about crime, they're saying, well, half our news is related to crime. This must mean crime's a major problem. It may be that they covered all the violent crime in the entire day, and there was very little of it for a large city. But to the people, it'll be salient of, oh, I just saw a whole bunch of crime each day on the news. This is a big problem we have. So this can lead to distorted understandings of the community, which can be problematic. We've seen a rise in online media, and it's transforming political communication and surpassing newspapers and television in importance. So getting news on online news sites or directly on social media. Online media have democratized political communications in some way. So there's been some benefits. Social media allows users to share unmediated views. So you can share whatever you're thinking. If you're on site of, say, a particular news story, you're participating in a particular event, you can share your perspective, and it's not filtered through the frames that the media are choosing to present the story. So you can get more different perspectives on the same story. Politicians can communicate directly with the public, which is beneficial. If you can hear directly from politicians and it's not, again, put through the lenses that the media is choosing to present it, that's a benefit to being able to hear directly from politicians. Campaign professionals can precisely target audiences. I'm not as sure whether this is a positive or negative, but it is part of the, I suppose, part of the democratic process. And then diversity of sources is available in news aggregators. So you can get sources from, oftentimes before you had like a small number of cable channels where you could choose a news sources from, or you might watch one or get one newspaper. Here, the news aggregators can be pulling together many different newspapers, many different news channels, many different blogs or whatever, so you could get access to news sources from around the world, getting, again, many different more perspectives and access to many more different stories. Online media, clearly, from a social media perspective, has been instrumental in mobilizing large numbers of people for mainstream and protest activities, which can be beneficial. In many of the social movements that we've seen in the last several years, been very beneficial having these protest activities. Social media played a clear role in, for example, the Arab Spring, but also can be negative in protests. If we think of the January 6th protest, again, social media played a prominent role there, and in helping to mobilize large number of people to that type of protest as well, which would be viewed as perhaps a negative side. Negative aspects of online media, used as a recruitment for extremist groups. It hasn't necessarily increased as much as we would have thought, resulted in a more knowledgeable public. Foreign interference in elections, because anybody gets a voice in the election and anyone can participate in social media. It has increased the ability of foreign actors to interfere in elections. Foreign interference in elections is nothing new. Foreign actors have been trying to influence elections in Canada and the US, around the world for decades. There's now have more levers for actually being able to do so, so it can play, do so much more effectively. And increased level of misinformation. Part of the problem with having increased number of voices is that you, and with anybody being able to have a voice, is that there's no content filter. There's no source for saying, you know, this is good information for this is bad information. News media, as good or bad as they used to be, so there were editors, there were fact checkers, there were certain information requirements usually required, not to say that news media never got it wrong. Traditional news media never got it wrong. Yeah, certainly did, right? But there was greater checks and balances in terms of information quality than you do in social media or have in social media. And so this has certainly led to increases in misinformation on all sides of the political spectrum. So often, based on more recent events, conservatives are blamed for high levels of misinformation. Certainly many liberals are misinformed, grossly misinformed as well. So this is something that's affecting everyone. All right, that's all for today. So next time we'll continue our look at the media.